I've had the privilege of corresponding with Nick, and I have been assisted by David when I came here on a visit, and this is great staff. So thanks for opening it up for us. Thanks for being here. Sorry for keeping you longer than what we intended. So I'm going to just give a background to the start of what was then Atterbury Army Airfield here in Columbus. And the brief presentation that I'm going to do is going to talk about the start of that airfield and through its usage in World War II. This is of special interest to me, as you know, with World War II history. And this is one of the chapters in my upcoming book that's coming out in May, Indiana Landmarks of World War II. So this comes from that presentation. So this is what it would have looked like back at the start of the Atterbury Army Airfield. Was built on 2,000 acres of farmland in mid-1942, so just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The goal of the airfield initially was thought to be an integrated air-ground combat center, combat training with the Army divisions that were training at nearby Camp Atterbury. We passed the exit for Camp Atterbury as we came down Interstate 65. So since they were training Army divisions for combat, the initial thought was having an airfield close to Camp Atterbury would allow for some integrated training between the Army ground forces and the Army air forces. That never quite materialized, however, and instead the airfield kind of went through a period of name changes and different starts and some stalls and stops and changes to its mission during the first few years. In fact, interestingly, it was not an Army plane that touched down here at Atterbury Army Airfield for the first time. It was a Navy plane. September of 1942, a Navy plane was forced to make an emergency landing. That was the first aircraft then to land on the unsurfaced runway at that time at the new airfield, which was still under construction. A few months later, the first Army plane touched down and troops began arriving in February 1943. By the spring of 43, cadets from nearby Freeman Field, which is in Seymour, Indiana, arrived, and they used the airfield to practice some takeoffs and landings. In September, the B-26 medium bombers from bombardment groups arrived for some training, and that's where we first see some of the Tuskegee pilots that spent some time here in Indiana, but that stay was short, both the B-26s and the Tuskegee pilots. So it really wasn't until March of 1944, let me just close out a window here since I can't see part of my screen. It wasn't really until March of 1944 that Atterbury Army Airfield settled into what could be considered a sustained mission, and that was training glider pilots for the Troop Carrier Command. Now, they would be piloted by two, and you'll see the nose of one of those gliders in the museum, unless that's the one you're referring to that's cut off.
It's available.
It's available, great, yeah, because that's one of the primary features here. But anyhow, piloted by two pilots, gliders were, and so this was an base, an airfield that trained those pilots. Now, what they would be going for is this pin, the glider pin that would indicate that you were part of the glider command and a pilot. So the Columbus area farmers not only had a chance to see the gliders in operation in the air, which would have looked something like this from the air view, but they also got a chance to see things more up close, that is the farmers, as sometimes those gliders had to make landings in the fields. And so farmers would get a little bit closer look at the gliders as they came down in their fields. The peak of glider pilot training at the Atterbury Army Airfield came in March of '45. So this is now toward the end of the European War, when 745 takeoffs and landings were recorded in one day. So just imagine that, 745. Now the glider would be, of course, pulled initially by a cargo plane, a C-46 or C-47, and would be pulled behind by a tow line, as you see in the photograph there. The gliders used by the Army Air Forces was the Waco CG-4A glider that were built here in the country. There were almost 14,000 of them built and delivered during the war years, manufactured at a cost of about $15,000 each. Now, they were made of wood, fabric, and a little bit of steel, measured 48 feet in length, stood just over 12.5 feet in height, with a wingspan of 48 feet. When fully loaded, they weighed about 7,500 pounds, and the gliders had room in their cargo holds for several different kinds of loads, either 13 soldiers, which you'll see a picture of here in a moment, a jeep and 4 soldiers, a 105 millimeter howitzer and 3 soldiers, an ammunition trailer, 6 wounded on stretchers and 1 medic, or a small bulldozer, or 3 mules. So you had some options there, but this is what it would look like with the human cargo. 2 benches facing each other, much like you have the benches here, and the soldiers in their combat gear, with the pilots then up front in the nose of the glider. Now, these gliders, as I mentioned, were flown by 2 pilots, and the gliders were towed by the C-47 cargo planes with a 350-foot rope. And when the gliders neared their destination, then there's one taking off, being pulled by the cargo plane. When they would reach their approximate destination, the tow rope then was released, and the gliders began their fast descent to the ground. The pilots of the gliders could steer relatively and turn relatively, but they could not stop their steady descent. They did their best, of course, to control the landing of their aircraft, but doing so without any engines and in fields fraught with natural and enemy-placed obstacles often meant that gliders broke apart on landing. Sadly, this would result in the loss of life for some of the glider crew, as well as extensive damage to the gliders. They generally were not used more than once, although there were some exceptions, and sometimes damage to the equipment that they carried. So you see the tow line there, and they're being pulled and released at the objective. Despite the risk of the catastrophic crashes, many gliders made relatively safe landings and successfully delivered their forces or their equipment to their objectives. Now, beginning with the invasion of Sicily in July of 1943, glider units played key roles in delivering troops and equipment behind the enemy lines in Europe. Throughout the war, the U.S. military used 4,003 gliders in 8 different air assault missions. And while that number included the almost 517 used for the Normandy invasion, an even greater number of gliders were used for Operation Market Garden in Holland. Well, that is 1,900 gliders, twice what was used in Normandy. And Operation Varsity, which was in the Rhine River regions of Germany, almost 1,000 used there. A total of 216 glider pilots died during these operations. Now, Bloomington, Indiana native William Bruce Dalton was one of those glider pilots that served in Europe. He was born in 1914 and graduated from Bloomington High School. In 1942, at the age of 27, he enlisted in the Army Reserve and began the flight glider program in Bloomington. He said in an interview, "I was 27 years old and eligible for the draft, and I thought being a glider pilot would be better than walking." This was in a 2004 interview with the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. On September 8, 1942, he was called up for active duty. For the next 20 months, he completed his basic and his primary and advanced glider training at several different Army airfields, although I don't believe here, right, Mr. Dalton? Did he train here?
That I don't.
I didn't see anything that indicated that he trained here. There were other sites, obviously, for glider training. He also waited around while other glider pilot classes ahead of him finished their training. Finally, after completing the 90 hours of flight training, he became a commissioned flight officer and pilot with the rank of a second lieutenant. He was assigned to the 43rd Troop Carrier Squadron, the 315th Troop Carrier Group, and arrived in England in the summer of 1944 to prepare for flight combat operations. He got his chance to fly a combat mission into Holland in September 1944 for Operation Market Garden, which was the largest airborne assault of World War II. He said during his interview, "I took a Jeep trailer and 8 medics." His squadron landed in a field with other gliders under gunfire, and the massive operation was designed for Allied paratroopers to secure key bridges in Holland and quickly penetrate Germany from the north, but tragically the operation failed and the war dragged on then for another 8 months. Dalton survived the war, and he returned to Columbus, he survived the war and returned to his wife and son in mid-1945, and then they made their home in Columbus, Indiana, where Dalton eventually owned and operated 2 men's clothing stores. Now, the training of glider pilots was not the last or even arguably the most important mission of the Atterbury Army Airfield. In August of 1944, the airfield began receiving C-47 transports of, back up here for a second because I just missed my slide. So in August 1944, the airfield began receiving C-47 air transports of injured service members who were flown in from the European theater after a stop at Mitchell Field in New York. From there, it was a 4.5-hour flight to Indiana, where they would land at Atterbury Army Airfield. The reason they landed there was because the proximity of the airfield to the Army's Wakeman General Hospital, which was located at Camp Atterbury, only 12 miles away. So the cargo planes would touch down here. Ambulances would be awaiting them. They would get into the ambulance for the 12-mile trip to the Atterbury Army Airfield. So here are just a couple pictures of loading patients. Oops, that moved fast. Loading patients onto the ambulances, and their destination then was 12 miles away at Camp Atterbury's Wakeman General Hospital. Now, most of the casualties came from England, but some were also flown in from France. After touching down at Atterbury Air Base, the patients were transported by ambulance to Wakeman, arriving within 1 hour of landing here at the airfield. And receiving and transporting the wounded continued throughout the final 12 months of the war. So it had this airfield had a changing mission and kind of struggled for a while to find its permanent footing. But the training of the glider pilots and then the transfer site for the wounded being flown in from Europe became 2 of its most important missions during World War II. At the end of the war, Atterbury Army Airfield became inactive but remained on standby status. It was reactivated in 1949, and was used during the Korean War and continued to operate in a reserve status through the Vietnam War. Now, in that time period, there's a gentleman that actually flew here and touched down at the airfield and had his own important mission from Terre Haute, Indiana. And that fellow is with us, and that is Bill Dunbar. So Bill, tell us briefly what you recall of your coming down to the airfield here was about.
Well, I was a base op supervisor at Terre Haute, the 113th Attack Fighter Squadron, and we needed a facility for the pilots that came in for the weekend drills to sleep at the one base house we had, and they needed bunk beds for them to sleep in. And we had standard steel cots, but they wanted to make double deckers. The only place that had the conversion rods, tubes to make those bunk beds into double deckers were here in supply at camp at Atterbury. So they sent me over here in a P-80 jet, and at that time there was, I think they've changed the configuration of runways because it doesn't look the same. But anyhow, they had the longest runway was 5,000 feet, and I took off from Terre Haute with just enough fuel to fly over, load up the parts, and take off and fly back to Terre Haute. So that was in 1955.
1955.
In a P-80.
In a P-80. That 5,000 feet ends
pretty
quickly in a P-80, right? Yeah. So that was Operation Bunk Bed or something like that. That was called. Yeah. Very important stuff. Men slept because Bill came here to get the parts necessary for that. Very good. Thank you.
Well, you know what the capacity of all that is?
Wakeman General Hospital.
Well, yeah, I guess that's.
That was the beginning construction of Wakeman. Wakeman was huge, one of the largest Army hospitals, and David, you probably are going to give us a detail on that.
Wakeman Army Hospital could hold 10,000 patients, and during World War II, 85,000 patients cycled through that hospital. So, I mean, it was a massive operation.
And many of them coming through this airfield,
Most of the wounded would be stabilized in England and then come over here for rehabilitation. Most of them came by ship, but a lot of them came by air. So all the ones that came by air, like was mentioned, would stop here and then go up to the hospital by ambulance.
Were they soldiers or airmen?
All branches. Any wounded in Europe.
Yeah.
The
So it was
Pacific ones usually went to the West Coast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was a major medical facility that was, again, facilitated because of the proximity of the airfield to Camp Atterbury's hospital with the transfers taking place here. That arguably is the most important mission that was accomplished between the cooperation of the airfield and the hospital.
And all of those buildings there are part of the hospital complex, and they're all interconnected. So they could wheel the patient from one department to the other without having to go outside. And I did some calculations, and I figured about 1,000 patients would be discharged or added every week. So just think about administering that operation with nothing but 3x5 cards and a typewriter.
Yeah. And some phenomenal work was done there in the area of burn victims and facial reconstructions. It was not just a hospital that had a great deal of general medical care. It had a great deal of very specific specialty medical care.
And one of the reasons for the location here was its proximity to Chicago. And as I understand, a lot of doctors came from Chicago to work down here.
Yeah. Well, it was then in 1954 that the name of the base was changed to Bakalar Air Force Base to honor a World War II pilot named John Edmund Bakalar, a Hammond, Indiana native, up in the region, the northwest part of Indiana. He was killed in action over France on September 1st, 1944. In 1970, all military operations at Bakalar Air Force Base were shut down, and in 1971, the Columbus Regional Airport took over the airfield. But in 1992, the Atterbury-Bakalar Museum was built here on part of the former airfield to preserve its memory, and the museum just dedicated an expansion in 2014. Now, getting back to Bruce Dalton for a moment, Mr. Dalton, the former glide pilot, I'm going to get back to that slide. Well, hang on a second. Let me see my slides in the view. Okay, here we are. So there's the. No, that didn't do it. Let's try again. I usually have the computer in front of me, so I can see where I'm at without having to turn around behind me, but there's not enough lead cord there. So anyhow, Mr. Bruce Dalton on the far right there, he became, the former glider pilot from Bloomington, he became one of the most active volunteers at the museum for just about 2 decades, and he is the one that pursued the relentless goal of finding and securing an authentic glider nose, which would have, of course, the cockpit, as a display for this museum, and it is one of its feature pieces. He helped raise the funds also for a future museum expansion to include the media center we're sitting in today, and it has its name, the William Bruce Dalton Media Center. So Bruce may not have had time here at Atterbury Army Airfield during his glider pilot training, but he had plenty of time here at the museum in the 90s and beyond. And the nose of the glider that we're going to see in the museum is largely the result of his efforts. Now, inside the museum, you'll find the nose of the glider that Dalton secured as a signature display for the museum. And from the inside of the nose, that's what the view, what it looks like for the 2 pilots that are flying the glider, and you'll be able to see that view as well. An exhibit that will tell the story of the glider training and missions. Other exhibits will tell the history of the airfield and showcase some of the units and people who trained at the former Army airfield and later Atterbury-Bakalar Air Force Base. There's a cutaway that you'll see, maybe, I don't know which closed off, maybe I shouldn't say something. What's going to be closed off?
The cutaway engine, you can still see it, we just have some stanchions.
Okay. There's a cutaway of a typical barracks that you'll see in the 1940s. An exhibit of aircraft, scale aircraft models that are hanging from the ceiling. You'll see the rotating beacon from the original airfield. And you'll also see a wall that has the Indiana Aviation Hall of Fame that displays the photographs and service summaries of Hoosier pilots who served in the Army and Air Force, including 4 women. Less than 2 blocks from the museum, and we'll stop there today, and now I have to go backwards, is the Atterbury Army Air Base barracks that was converted to a chapel during the Korean War. It's the only building that remains. Let's see, where's my picture of that? I'm getting my pictures mixed up here. Actually, there it is. So that converted barracks was made into a chapel then during the Korean War, and it's the only building that remains from the former World War II airfield. It's just a short distance from here, restored from 1995 to 1998. The chapel was renamed the Gene Norbeck Memorial Chapel, and while Norbeck didn't have any direct connection in terms of military training to Atterbury Army Airfield, she had a lot to do with the city of Columbus and military flying. A Columbus, Indiana native, she was, that's out of order. A Columbus, Indiana native, she was born November 14th, 1912 and graduated from Columbus High School in 1929. She earned her civilian pilot's license while she attended the State College of Washington, where she graduated in 1933. In 1940, she married Edward Norbeck, so her name, last name. The Norbecks were living in Honolulu on December 7th, 1941. And after the attack at Pearl Harbor, they both volunteered to become air wardens. Later, when her husband Edward joined the Army in 1943, Jean, wanting to do her part, joined the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs, that same year. After completing her training, she was assigned as a test pilot at Camp Shaw in South Carolina. Just show you another photograph there of her. And she and other WASPs flew training planes that had been redlined due to mechanical problems. And then after the mechanical problem was fixed, or supposed to have been fixed, they would test the plane out to make sure that it was. Well, on October 16, 1944, she was assigned to test fly a Vultee BT-13 primary trainer that had been reported as having a stuck wing. During her flight, the left wing failed, and she crashed while attempting to land. Norbeck was killed instantly. There's the BT Vultee 13, the primary trainer that you see there. And tragically, as is indicated, in the crash, she lost her life. Her body was transported back to her hometown in Columbus here, where she received a burial that was very unusual for women at the time, and that is a burial that included a flag and military escort. Women technically did not qualify for funeral honors, military funeral honors. And this was unusual because the WASPs were listed as civil service employees and not official members of the military, but she was afforded that honor. She was 32 years old at the time of her death. She and Edward had no children, but her service is memorialized in the naming of the chapel at this base. So we will see that as well. Any questions as we prepare to look at the couple of videos that are very short, and then the museum? Yes?
Why and how were there two pilots to the glider?
Why and how?
Pilot and co-pilot.
Yeah.
A lot of airplanes had two pilots. I'm not sure why they did it that way.
I mean, I suppose, should one become incapacitated, there's still someone that can fly the glider in this case. And they're probably, even on the glider, as with planes, I mean, co-pilots have certain responsibilities that free the pilot up for doing other responsibilities that the pilot's doing. So it was always designed as a two-person operation. But I don't know the specifics as to what the co-pilot did different than the pilot. Yeah, Richard?
Okay, if there's a aircraft in front and the glider is attached by the tow line, isn't there going to be a jerk? Isn't there going to be as the aircraft takes off, that wouldn't the glider just kind of?
That's a good question, because there was a type of takeoff that was called a snatch takeoff.
I think I got a picture of that.
You've got a picture of it, where the glider is situated on the ground and the tow cable is attached to it, and then it runs to two poles that are 20 feet apart, so that the C-47 can fly by with a tail hook and grab that and snatch the glider right off the ground. So the question is, well, why didn't that pull the whole front end of the glider apart?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is the 350-foot long tow rope had nylon in it, so it would stretch just like a bungee cord.
Okay.
So if you see a video of a snatch takeoff, you'll see the C-47 go by, snatch the cable, and the glider starts out moving very slowly, and then it picks up speed as the cable comes back together. But yes, if the cable couldn't stretch, you'd tear that glider apart.
At the release, which I believe was accomplished from the glider pilot.
Yes, there's a handle above the pilot's seat a little bit forward, and he just pulls down on that, and that releases the cable.
The tow line.
Tow line.
The tow line, yeah. Have any of you been in a glider before? All right, so we've got one glider.
Not intentionally.
Not intentionally. Oh,
Well,
Did you
not
say
in one
no?
of those gliders, but the one up,
Yeah.
by Muncie.
yeah, in a glider today, I mean, yeah. Yeah, so you know what that's like when you let go of the, it's not like, I mean, you just, all of a sudden you see that plane getting further away, you know? You don't really notice it because you're moving at the same speed, and then all of a sudden it's cut off and now you're on your own.
Suddenly it's silent.
It's silent, yes, please.
What was the advantage of using gliders? To me, it doesn't seem like they have the control that you would with motors.
Well, the intent is to get behind enemy lines, and they can land in smaller places. They're less heavy, they're traveling at less speed, and they can get men and equipment into key strategic locations for military operations. So largely that was behind enemy lines.
The thinking originally was, it takes a few weeks to train a paratrooper because they have to do all this stuff about controlling the parachute and doing the landing and all that. The guys who rode the glider were just regular infantry. They just took regular infantry guys, put them in there and said, sit on that bench, don't move until you're on the ground.
No training necessary, but prayers encouraged.
And also I think the thought was that there's a lot of broken legs amongst parachutists, so it's a little bit safer way to get on the ground. That turned out to not be true, really. That was the original thought. Later on, they came up with the idea of the only way to get heavy equipment on the ground is with a glider. Besides carrying troops, they could also carry a jeep, artillery, trailers of extra ammunition. Old airplanes were really small and had a small door. You couldn't push a jeep out the airplane like you can on big airplanes. So what they would do, kind of like a boat trailer, you take your big piece of equipment and tow it behind the airplane. That way it would circle and then land. So ultimately they went from carrying a lot of troops to mostly carrying cargo, because that was the only way to get heavy cargo loads down to the ground.
Richard?
I'm sorry, I probably missed what you said, but did some of these guys participate in D-Day, in Normandy?
Yeah, there are over 500 gliders that participated in D-Day, but the largest was Operation Market Garden, which Holland, which was over
But
1,200.
some of them were D-Day present.
I'm sorry,
They were present for the D-Day
about 517. Yeah,
517.
yeah.
So every time they had an airborne operation with paratroopers, there were also gliders involved. That was just the standard mix that they used.
Right, to get the equipment as
Paratroopers,
well
and
as
then they'd have
additional
gliders
men.
with extra equipment that would come down. And we have a short video we'll show
Yeah.
at D-Day.
Yes, please, Ken.
What happened to the gliders after they landed, the glider itself?
Well, it was usually done, but there are times that they were retrieved too.
In combat, 95% of them never flew again. They ended up just being scrapped by local farmers.
Okay, because you said one-time use.
If they
Yeah.
landed successfully.
In training, they could land in an open field by the runway and they would reuse them. We also have a short video of D-Day. The Germans did all they could to make it impossible to land a glider. They would put stakes in any open
Rommel's
field.
asparagus, right?
They would dig trenches across open fields besides shooting at them. If they managed to crash land and be able to walk away from it, it was a success.
Yeah.
But like I said, only about 5% of the gliders were repairable and they could fly again.
Well, and because of the material that they're made out of, wood,
It worked.
it worked, but it was also very difficult to have surviving gliders for museums and things like that. You won't see too many gliders from World War II because of the breakdown of the materials after, you know.
So besides all the gliders being destroyed on a one-way mission landing, about 10% of the guys were killed or injured just getting on the ground. But to the Army, you know, it's nature of the beast.
Yeah.
We were in Normandy, I think it was 2019, and I believe at one point during the tour, there was a glider, or a part of a glider, that was, so some of them were salvaged, but not very little.
Yeah. Well, the British had their own as well, the Horsa,
Yeah.
and they were a little different configuration, but
Still.
you've got some British ones, and then of course the U.S. ones. Yeah, Kay.
So then the pilots of the gliders would just join the troops after they landed?
Yeah, they would have missions, a mission of getting to a certain objective, to a certain destination point, like the paratroopers. I mean, they were behind enemy lines, and they would have their objective of controlling bridges, key roads.
So they
The glider pilots are relatively more valuable than the infantry because it took longer to train them. So they tried to get the gliders back to England as soon as possible so they could fly another mission.
The pilots, yeah.
So depending on where they landed, you know, if they were able to, they would separate from the infantry guys they were with and gather at headquarters, and as soon as possible they'd get back to England.
Hey, you survived. We're gonna give you a chance to do it again.
If they were isolated all by themselves, well, they would just become infantry until they could get back to the major headquarters.
Okay.
I mean, really, they had to tell these guys where they got into this, that it just, I mean, the chance of survival in one of those dudes,
Pretty small.
very small.
It wasn't, I mean, you kind of choose your poison, right? I mean, you can be in those C-47s and they're getting flak from every direction and trying to get their load of paratroopers out, often not at the destination they were supposed to. So there are multiple ways to die, but certainly in a glider, you were pretty vulnerable.
And besides the whole airborne operation, landing on the beach at Normandy wasn't the picnic either.
Yeah.
There was no easy way to
No
do
easy
it.
way into the
There's no easy way to
European
do
theater.
this.
Yeah, good point. Any of that final questions? Because we got a couple videos we want to watch too. Yeah, Bill.
You didn't mention that about 1949, they, was it 48 that the Air Force became?
Yeah,
separate
48
from
I
the
think
Army?
is when the Air Force became
Then
separate.
it became a reserve Air Force base,
It did, yes.
and they had a C-46 troop carrier unit here.
Ah,
And in the winter of '49, Sam and I came down here with a reserve captain who was trying to enlisted men for the unit. But they wouldn't take us because we were already in the Army Guard up in our hometown.
right.
But we spent Saturday and Sunday here, and it fogged in, so they couldn't fly.
Okay.
But Sam and I sat in the cockpit.
You
of
saw the
C-
C-46 cargo planes.
and we sat, they had some C-45s and some other airplanes, and
Okay.
Sam and I sat in the cockpit of a C-45 for a while. Since they couldn't take us, they just let us roam the base for the day.
Ah,
But we stayed overnight in one of those barracks buildings I was talking
okay,
about.
yeah.
And it had a potbelly stove, a fire
Sure.
with coal.
Yeah. You'll see that with the cutaway, the barrack,
Yeah.
example of a barracks,
So
yeah.
that was our experience here in '49.
Oh. Well, maybe it's the one that they cut away here,
We
and,
don't know.
yeah, who knows? You know, if you could just get those pieces again, we can get those cots stacked for you, and you and Sam could do the bunk
They're
bed
probably still in
thing.
the warehouse.
That may, it's still in the warehouse, yeah, that might be, yeah. Anybody else? Yes, please.
I'm interested that the huge hospital was here, so far from the coast. Was that a safety measure? How did they decide to have it here instead of closer to the coast, east coast, where they were flying
Yeah.
patients in from?
Well, this wasn't the only hospital, so there were other hospitals in the country, but it was one of the major ones. I don't recall initially Camp Atterbury's hospital was just designed to serve the training base itself, which was a large number of people, 40,000 people with an Army division. But somewhere along the line, then it was decided that whether because of just the fact you already had the hospital, you had the grounds, you had a proximity to Chicago, the rail lines, everything else, and the nearby airfield for bringing in wounded patients, that hospital then became expanded to a great deal. But I can't say for sure what other factors might have been in that. David, do you have any ideas?
No, pretty much that, in that all the bases and hospitals and all that were kind of scattered across the country. And there's no best place in the world to have a hospital, so they scattered them about. There were several of them. I'm sure they had some on the East Coast by Boston, where a lot of the Boston doctors were that they could tap into. I did read that one of the reasons was they wanted in the Midwest near Chicago, because Chicago had a reputation with a lot of hospitals and medical schools. I don't think there's any really good reason.
Well, Indiana University had a medical school too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but like we said, there were several
Yeah.
of these very large hospitals scattered across the country.
Right.
And, a lot of people just don't know anything about, at Camp Atterbury, they had like 85,000 wounded went through there. And the military knew they were in a war, so they just sat down and they built very large temporary hospitals that were open for a couple of years and then they closed them.
yeah, it did not stay open very long, yeah.
Do you
It's all
know,
torn down
do you
now,
know if they
there's
used
nothing
any of the German
left.
prisoners?
You
as
can
water?
still see
They didn't?
several dilapidated buildings that were part of Wakeman General Hospital. Some of it is already kind of being some of it is being grown over with vegetation. But there probably are at least half a dozen buildings that you can see right on, is it Hospital Road?
Yes.
Right off Hospital Road to the north. You can still see, in fact, I've got photos, but not this laptop, of some of those buildings, but they're slowly,
Returning to nature.
returning to nature. I was gonna say, what's another word for caving in?
Deteriorating.
Yeah, they're deteriorating, yeah. So are we ready for a couple of videos to round out the orientation so that we can get to the museum? We good? All right, thanks for your questions, very good. And David and Nick, thank you for filling in the information as well.
Since he kind of covered